So good afternoon. I am Carolyn Chen, co-director of the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion, and I want to welcome you to the inaugural event in the public lecture series on religion, race, democracy, and the American dream. Before introducing our speaker today, I want to express gratitude to a few people who made pulling off a hybrid event during a pandemic possible. Not only possible, but so smooth and so easy. So I want to thank Kai Nguyen, Patty Dunlop, and Hannah Hart. Thank you so much for paying attention to every little detail. I'd also like to acknowledge the generous support of the Henry Luce Foundation, the Graduate Theological Union, the Asian American Research Center, and the Othering and Belonging Institute for making this event possible. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jonathan Tran as our speaker today. I really can think of no one better to be our inaugural speaker in our series on race, religion, and democracy and the American dream than Dr. Tran. So Jonathan, your ears must be itching because for the last 6 months, everyone I spoke to about religion and race during that time said the same thing. They all said, you've got to read Jonathan Tran's book on racial capitalism. and it was just been all the buzz. Dr. Tran is a theologian and an ethicist. He is professor of philosophical theology and the George W. Baines Chair of Religion at Baylor University. He received his MDiv and PhD at Duke University, where he studied under Stanley Hauerwas. Dr. Tran has published 4 books on a wide and diverse set of topics that examine the theological and political implications of human life and language, including the Vietnam War and the Theology of Memory, Foucault and Theology, and theological reflections on the TV miniseries, The Wire. That one sounds really fun. He's now working on a book with Stanley Hauerwas titled Christianity and the Promise of Politics. So we'll have to invite you again to talk on that one. Dr. Tran's talk today draws from his highly anticipated new book, Asian Americans and the Spirit of Racial Capitalism, that reframes anti-racism and Asian Americans in terms of a theological account of political economy. Welcome, Dr. Tran.
Thank you, Carolyn. I'm convinced that the many people who registered for this online and have sold out the book in a different context are really my mom, so who's registered secretly and bought lots of copies of the book. So it's a real pleasure and honor to be here with you all. Really grateful to be hosted by Professor Carolyn Chen and the various UC Berkeley and offices, as well as the Graduate Theological Union. Different folks have contributed to my being here in person. I've long thought that Berkeley is America's greatest graduate school, having birthed whole swaths of critical and social theory that have transformed the way many of us academics think. Indeed, a number of the scholars who directly informed the book are Berkeley alum, including Rachel Prahinsky, Lindsay Dillon, Russell Jung, who is in the audience today, Vincent Lloyd, among others. This summer, I and the sociologist Rich Wood, himself a Berkeley alum, facilitated a young scholars program for the Social Science Research Council that featured a number of Berkeley students raised up by the great Saba Mahmood. And it's a deep honor to speak in a space so nourished by giants. I should say, programmatic note, my daughter is applying to be an undergraduate at Berkeley. And in case any undergraduate admissions officers are listening on the Zoom, I want you to know that she is much more sensible and charming than I. That is unless you want her to be insensible and charmless, in which case I want you to know we're quite the same person. So, Carolyn mentioned my first book, The Vietnam War and Theologies of Memory. And in some ways, I've written this book to correct an error that happened, a typo that happened in that book, literally on the first page, in the first line of the book. So I'll divulge the typo here for everybody. So did you all know that the word wanton, as in wanton violence, and wonton, as in the noodle soup, are two different words.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't. And apparently none of the copy editors did either. And so the first line of the book is something like, the Americans came to Vietnam and spread wonton violence all over the country. So you have this image of Huey helicopters, spraying noodle soup on the people there. So initially I had written, given the context of Berkeley, an account for this lecture. I'd written an account of how identitarian anti-racism abets in increasingly balkanized forms of neoliberal governmentality, and the ways it engrafts Asian Americans into its politics. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how Berkeley's long history of radical democratic theory, most embodied in the great theorist Sheldon Wolin, who was nourished here through the Berkeley's democratic movement in the 60s, really gives us a way out. But considering I thought, well, people probably want to hear most about the book, I want to say, please ask me about that later, about how the notion of the American dream gets co-opted into neoliberal politics, how Asian Americans are pulled into that, often find forms of identity in that, and how radical democratic theorizing may help us think through that. As well as I hope people will ask me about what we might think about the current Aquafina situation. So, okay, so what I do have to say is a lecture I've subtitled The Anti-Racist Culture War and Its Disconnects on Conventions, Deflections, and Alternative Idioms. My recent book, Asian Americans and the Spirit of Racial Capitalism, comes from a sense I have of a yawning disconnect within our anti-racist politics. The sense has only grown since the book was released, and I have had to clarify its central claims. The disconnect sits between two realities. On the one side of the disconnect is the political economic conditions that produce racism's breathtaking inequality and injustice. Systems and structures of exploitation and extraction that now threaten the world with global heat death. On the other side is the orthodox anti-racist discourses meant to address these conditions, but have mostly only further entrenched and enabled them. My book attempts to describe and diagnose this disconnect and offers positive proposals going forward. It makes its case by putting itself in the surprising position of Asian Americans, and specifically Asian American Christians. It suggests that looking at things from the position of those caught in the lurch of the disconnect gains some purchase on the world in which we find ourselves. This positioning takes what has often been, if I can speak personally, the rather painful experience of being marginalized by anti-racism after having already been marginalized by racism. And it uses that experience to force questions emblematized and emboldened by those painful experiences. To get to the disconnect, let me first explain racism as I see it. Among other things, racism serves as ideological justification for dominative exploitation. It utilizes regnant concepts of race and deploys them to explain away systems and structures of dehumanizing exploitation and inequality. It naturalizes what are obviously unnatural relationships forced between value and labor and land and bodies. The ultimate gaslighting move, it blames the oppressed for their oppressions, claiming it is something about them, something natural, something about their race. This naturalization justifies the morally unjustifiable and makes what is obviously evil, idolatrous, and abhorrent look good, true, and beautiful. It has built into its politics a divide and conquer strategy whereby the oppressed blame each other rather than their oppressors. Oliver Cromwell Cox of the Black radical tradition laid this out when he observed that poor whites, migrant Chinese, and Jim Crow African Americans suffered similar, if also unique, oppressions at the hands of politicians, factory owners, planters, labor agents, managerial elites, and so on. But that it was the fate of those crushed by racial capitalism to blame one another, while giving a free pass to those most responsible for their sad lot in life. Rather than finding lines of sight that might build toward coalitional solidarity against their oppressors, they became divided by race. Now oppressed whites sided with their white oppressors in exchange for what Du Bois called the psychological wage of white racial identity, and participated in all manner of white supremacist violence in order to seal the deal. All the while, African Americans and Chinese were made enemies of the nation and enemies of one another. Notice that the use of race as an ontological category that justifies exploitation, one might call this death by ontology. That this way of speaking finds parallels in the ways we speak about non-human creatures as somehow so different enough to warrant altogether different moral considerations. Notice how these ways of speaking map onto ways of behaving. The words facilitating the behavior and the behavior making sense of the words. And then notice it will be the ordinary ways we speak of things that naturalize the relationships, conventionalizing the concepts that operationalize structures and systems facilitating domination and exploitation. Such conventionalization is what domination amounts to. The power to do what one will as a matter of course, to so lord over another that the relationship between master and slave, citizen and alien, human and non-human become the most natural thing in the world. Conventions of speech settle into conventions of mind, therefore comprising a psyche, into conventions of value, therefore creating a culture, and into conventions of social life, therefore convening a community. Nothing less than a collective psyche, community, and culture would be necessary to take folk fictions about race and create and continue a world of racial terror. Notice that once the conventions of speech catalyze a world, bring that world together, bring it to life, give it energy, that world will go on as long as the conventions do. Just as the conventions will go on as long as that world does, mutually informing and reinforcing. If you want to challenge that world, you're going to need to dismantle enough of it in order to destabilize the conventions. And in order to destabilize the conventions, you're going to need to pull that world apart. That is all to say, racism persists because it works. We need to ask what racism is by asking what racism does, what it enables. In his devastating law review article, After We're Gone, Derek Bell imagined space traders coming to Earth and taking all of America's Black people. Bell's initial point looks to be about how Black people matter so little to Americans that the nation would trade them away for the sake of convenience. But Bell's final point is that the nation would never make that trade, because without anti-Blackness, there would be no America. We have built an entire political economy that relies on racism. We can no more give up the racism than can we give up the political economy that funds our lives. Racism persists because racism works. It does not, of course, work for all of us, just some of us. That is somewhat the point. Racism is a political economic arrangement where each of the terms political and economic matter. Rather than split hairs trying to figure out which came first, the political chicken or the economic egg, we're better off recognizing that one cannot be thought without the other. Criticisms that say analyses focused on racial capitalism reduce too much to economics seem to miss the fact that any economy capable of running a society cannot by its nature be only economic. That matters of value and labor and land and bodies are political through and through. The regularity with which one encounters this complaint that I'm focusing too much on economics suggests that we are so untrained in thinking about how things actually work in their material reality, so unfamiliar with empirical methods, that any talk about economy is already too much talk about economy. If that is what we have come to in our intellectual life, then it serves as an indictment of the academy's cultural turn. The cultural turn in theory as part of the university's vanguard elitism. A general cultural analysis would be no more devoid of material culture than would a political analysis be void of economics. To speak of political economy is to speak as though both of the concepts organizing terms matter. So much for the political economic conditions that produce racism's breathtaking inequality and injustice. Systems and structures of exploitation and extraction that I said now threaten the world with global heat death. What about the disconnect between the racial capitalist conditions I described and orthodox anti-racist discourse meant to address them? And how these discourses only further entrench and further enable the conditions. Rather than seeking to dismantle society held up by concepts of race and conventions of racialization, contemporary anti-racism turns its attention to waging a cultural war based on those very concepts and conventions. I characterize this as a culture war for two reasons. First, it prosecutes the war at the site of racial identities, as if racial identities do not derive from political economies, specifically the political economy of what the Black radical tradition calls racial capitalism. The culture war believes defeating racism entails winning this culture war, and believes winning the culture war entails some racial identities winning out over other racial identities. It separates out the racial identity from the political economy and its superstructure that gives it meaning. Second, focused as it is on racial identities, it wages war against certain conventions, specifically conventions about racial identity, but it deploys a tactic that singles out racial concepts while leaving standing the very structures and systems that conventionalize them. Recall that conventionalization catalyzes concepts and structures and systems together. It puts them in play through a collective psyche, community, and culture. If that is the case, challenging the conventions and their racial terrors requires challenging both the concepts and their catalyzed structures and systems. Yet, the anti-racist culture war goes after the racial concepts that at best ignore and at worst reinforce the political economic structures and systems. We then have a culture war that analytically subordinates political economy and its structures and systems to racial identity and racial conventions. As a culture war, it makes a lot of noise, but ultimately it risks very little. Having decided that political and economy can be treated as separately occurring entities, which is another way of putting all of this, this war ends up giving new life to the political economy of racial capitalism. What then does this culture war look like practically? On the one side are whites and those party to their racism, within this thinking, within this framework. Their racism is essential to who they are as white people. Their whiteness, as the anti-racist culture warriors speak of it, must at all costs be identified, shouted down, and removed from polite society. On the other side of the culture war is anyone identified against whiteness. These anti-racists, themselves often white, commit themselves to, on the one side, rejecting whiteness, and on the other, championing whatever opposes it. The culture war's exclusive attention on race diverts attention away from how these very anti-racists profit from the very system of benefits they protest. When we are formed in this culture war, when it is the air we breathe and the water we swim in, we are taught to look for respective racial identities. In the Latin, the personae dramatis driving the story. And we are taught to believe that racial identity as a function of essential racial qualities or as a function of racialization somehow explains things. We start to think in these ways. Why do whites dominate? Well, it's because they're white. Here's a logical fallacy mired in circular logic. The great Barbara J. Fields caricatures this thinking by saying this, describing it and characterizing it in these terms. Whiteness is a racial identity, therefore white people have a racial identity. Whiteness equals white supremacy, therefore European immigrants became white by adopting white supremacy. Whiteness entails material benefits, therefore the material benefits white people receive are a reward for whiteness. Now, make no mistake about it. White supremacists created this racial culture war, and they set up the terms of its enactment. Remember that it was first white supremacists who created the idea that race explains things, inventing as they did the racial capitalist dynamic between use, identity, and justification in a continuous feedback loop. Downstream, the rest of us are simply performing this war. And in performing it, reinforcing the grammar of its conventions and all but guaranteeing its future. The disconnect comes in the fact that perpetrating the culture war, as contemporary anti-racists have committed themselves to doing, leaves untouched the very structures and systems it claims to attack. A difficult question we should ask ourselves is this: has the current anti-racist culture war done much to change the systems and structures of exploitation and extraction? One could ask the same question conversely by asking how much more could be gained if we stopped pursuing these questions along and exclusively the lines of racial identity and instead examined how structures and systems actually work. We might discover, for example, that racist redlining ultimately proved redundant against the backdrop of housing systems that were long ago set up against Black life. One would see that we can remove the redlining racist by way of what? DEI initiatives meant to train loan processors out of their implicit biases. We could do that and we would still have up and running systems of extraction that exploit Black Americans through what Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor calls predatory inclusion. These systems and structures do not require for their operations the very personas dramatis we have been taught to search out, whether it be the red-faced sheriff armed with attack dogs or the Karen figure whose whiteness somehow transcends patriarchy and misogyny. These systems persist in large part because people refuse to surrender their system of benefits. These beneficiaries might even be card-carrying anti-racists, with their dog-eared copies of white fragility and memorized Ta-Nehisi Coates one-liners. One way to ask the question of whether the current anti-racist culture war has done much to change the systems and structures of exploitation and extraction is to examine the very anti-racist initiatives meant to address them. And here I mean the aforementioned DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion trainings, ubiquitous now in American institutions, including institutions of higher education. Empirical review of these programs reveals that not only do they not change systems and structures of exploitation and extraction, but they tend to harm the one thing they seek, diversity. They fail to make institutions more diverse, and they often prove counterproductive to the cause of diversity. These programs start off with the well-intentioned goal of addressing things like institutional racism, but tend to devolve into recitals of white guilt that leave institutions largely untouched. Now, performative sentimentalism followed by inaction should be familiar to anyone who has ever attended an evangelical retreat, where the crescendo of emotion and conviction is followed once down the mountain and returned to regular life to the same old thing. I doubt that the blame here lies at the feet of DEI professionals, who are some of the bravest people I know, pursuing some of the noblest goals society can ask for. Rather, the failure of these initiatives speak to just how inveterately powerful these structures and systems are, how baked in the conventions and how tightly they hold our world together. So powerful, baked in, and tight that even efforts set against them cannot help becoming like them. Rather than blaming diversity and DEI professionals, we need to step back and understand their history. DEI culture arose at a moment in American life when the upheavals of the 1960s and the 1970s, with their freedom struggles, liberation and civil rights movements, third world coalitions, class considerations, and union organizing, all that ran into a buzzsaw in the 1980s under the name neoliberal capitalism. This political economy follows from the conviction that if the world that benefits the powerful is going to survive challenges to its power, the government is going to need to get in bed with the market. In this world, DEI never stood a chance. The best that it could do was hitch its wagon to an ascending therapeutic culture, and within the university, the cultural turn, and hope to find enough traction there to gain a hearing. It could do little to stave off a government-backed system of inequality, but it could stir up impressive amounts of white guilt. One way of coming to terms with this is for us academics to examine whether our universities, our own diversity strategies, do much more than diversify the ranks of the managerial elite, present company included, serving as gatekeepers for entrance into upper middle class society. Again, there is no more noble goal than diversity and no braver soul than those who pursue it. As well, it is not that institutional diversity efforts cannot connect to reparative forms of justice. It's just that as currently constituted, they tend not to. Positioned against the political economy of racial capitalism, they don't stand much of a chance. They do what they can. From here, things only get worse. Frustrated that these initiatives have done so little to change things, and confused about the nature of the problem, forgetful that what makes racism systematic is the alchemy of concepts, conventions, and institutions, we anti-racists redouble our culture war efforts and bring greater and greater heat to the issue, thinking that the lack of progress stems from a lack of personal conviction and commitment, and therefore began to call out anyone seen as so lacking. No wonder our common spaces have become ridden by fear, and fear not of racial capitalism's many injustices and inequalities, but fear of what? Of being called racist. Now, rather than pursuing truth and justice, we virtue signal to ensure we stay on the right side of the culture war. We should not be surprised, even as we are properly dismayed by the illiberalism running through our intellectual discourse and public conversation. Now all yields to ad hominem arguments, with fallacious circular arguments passed off as critical rigor. Or more precisely, I should say, all again yields to ad hominem arguments, with their logically fallacious circular arguments passed off as intellectual rigor. Let us turn to Asian Americans, who not only tend to not count within the culture war's founding white-black binary, but are rendered by the culture war suspicious. Perhaps how double agents, turncoats, and neutral parties are viewed as suspicious. Practically at issue in my book is the particular role the culture war grants Asian Americans. To put the matter sharply, I wonder if the Asian American part of the story is one where Asian Americans are engrafted into racial capitalism's inequalities and injustices by doing two things at once and in tandem. Benefit from the racial capitalist political economy while covering over those benefits by laying claim to racial victimization. Now, let me be clear here. In no way am I denying that Asian Americans have been victimized. If COVID has made anything clear, it has made clear by the nearly 10,000 reported instances of anti-API racism, has shown that Asian Americans have and have throughout their history been victims of racism. Large swaths of my book document and recount the political economic logic of this violence as it was carried forth under the banner of the Yellow Peril, including what became the largest mass lynching in US history. Between this history and the current spate of anti-AAPI racism is regular life for Asian Americans who suffer microaggressive behavior that is deadly and deadening precisely for its tie into systems and structures that are anything but micro. Just as well, we should observe that while the vast majority of these cases involve white perpetrators, there are still those instances where the racism comes at the hands of other people of color. These can often be more painful, mixing feelings of fear and exposure and embarrassment with rejection, betrayal, and confusion. Rather than denying or diminishing the harm of these many and continuous instances of victimization, I want to point out how the role given to Asian Americans scripts them as beneficiaries whose victimizations obscure those benefits. The literature within the various fields of Asian American studies tends to emphasize the victimization while underestimating the benefits that come on the backside of the victimization. Viet Thanh Nguyen, also a Berkeley graduate, famous for his novel The Sympathizer, cut his teeth on Asian American literary studies by arguing that while the trope of resistance reigns supreme in that field, not enough attention is given to how Asian Americans benefit from the commodification of Asian American culture. As well, the legal theorist Nancy Leong makes a similar point using what she calls the concept of identity capitalism. For my part, I trace how Asian Americans not only participate in forms of resource hoarding in local school systems, but gain Asian American identity in part by doing so. However, none of this stands out when one examines the standard course of research projects within Asian American studies. The heavy emphasis on victimization deflects attention away from the victimizing, seemingly in order to keep the right hand from knowing what the left hand is doing. Part of the problem with this separation is that it brings little clarity to how racial capitalism works, and therefore fails to clarify possible routes of resistance. I would like to think that the two things at once and in tandem realities of being both victims and victimizers are neither mutually exclusive, nor need they be seen as mutually exclusive. Yet one can see how prosecuting a culture war requires the very deflection I've just described. Pressing its case against whiteness as pure evil seems to require the strategic presentation of pure innocence. Yeah, I want to say that victimizing and victimization might actually be mutually illuminating, showing not only the complexity of moral life under racial capitalism, but accordingly how victims can resist these inducements, even in the face of the greatest forms of victimization. Just as well, it might be thought that racial solidarity requires us to be silent about what we people of color do to one another. Then I want to say that if our coalitions are going to be strong ones, they will need to be honest ones. I argue in the book that if racial capitalism uses race to facilitate dominative exploitation, then anti-racism should set its sights on two goals. First, diminishing racialization's ability to facilitate domination, which involves deflating racial modes of analysis. And secondly, displacing exploitation as the basis of political economy, which involves highlighting alternative idioms by which political economy is imagined. The second goal involves me in the second half of the book constructing an account of what I call deep economy, which I oppose to racial capitalism. Deep economy incarnates a political economy that the earlier Christian church referred to as the divine economy. Divine economy sees creation as hardwired for justice and mercy, insofar as God authors and sustains creation. From here, I draw out two formulations: that justice and mercy are natural to the world because justice and mercy are natural to God. And accordingly, that the primary political key of Christianity is not finally resistance, but more so proclamation. I think these formulations are crucial if we are to cultivate the kinds of idioms necessary for reimagining our political economic lives, which is to say, our lives in the world. If Christianity is to offer good news to a planet under threat from racial capitalism, it will need stories powerful enough to not only resist those forces, but more so proclaim through alternative concepts and conventions and their attending structures and systems something altogether different. I narrate these formulations in the book by way of a contemporary Christian community that through its church, software company, neighborhood school, and redistributive and reparative funding structures approximates something like this deep economy. It does so in nearby Black San Francisco, through an interconnected ecology it believes shot through with God's justice and mercy. The fact that these are mostly Asian Americans whose University of California and Stanford University educations require that they dispossess themselves of their advantages, and whose experience as marginalized people apprise them of the need to do so, is my attempt to offer different scripts for being Asian American. Scripts where the Christianity makes all the difference. The fact that this is a story of a local Christian church is my attempt to offer an account of race and racism where Christianity is more than a villain. one final thought. A point of controversy for my book will be the question of what racial identity comes to once I have made it my case against race as a catalyzing agent of dominant exploitation. The answer for me is not post-racial colorblindness. We will need to keep racial categories on the table enough to trace out and possibly reverse the damage done by racial capitalism. I hope that we can do that while avoiding modes of analysis where racial identity blocks our ability to bring as much as possible into view, which is what I think a political economic analysis can do, especially when theologically formulated in order to bring the world into focus. Beyond that, I admit that I am not entirely sure what racial identity comes to. The efforts on behalf of some individuals and communities to reverse engineer racial identity in order to offset those identifications used to facilitate racial capitalism and instead constructively embody forms of racial dignity, agency, and community have been undeniably powerful and important. Such reimagined racial identities will need to take into account racial capitalism's ever clever ability to commodify racial identities and to put them into competition with one another. Just as well, they will want to avoid racial identities essentializing persons in ways that naturalize race as a concept all over again, especially as these efforts get put in service of an illiberalism I described earlier. Some have tried to do this by developing race as an explicitly political identity. And if this can be combined with certain philosophical insights that underscore the fluid nature of identity as such, and certain ironic postures towards it, all the better. I will admit that while I find these possibilities promising and those inhabiting them admirable, I'm still not sure that I, as an Asian American Christian, have been able to figure out how to do this. But that might only mean that I am not sufficiently Asian American for some people's tastes, or not Christian enough, or maybe too Asian or too Christian for that matter. Thank you. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks for the great thesis and the presentation. You know, Carol and I, we talk a lot about the victimization paradigm for Asian American studies, and appreciate your challenge of that. I think you offer a model of deep economy through Redeemer's Church's efforts as a counter to anti-racist discourse that perpetuates political economy as particularly different. I would really ask, Redeemer's efforts are still embedded in that political economy. They're sorry to say this, their school tries to make students upwardly mobile. Their loan programs operate in a capitalist system. Their software company makes money off of tech companies. So they are just as complicit and embedded in these political structures and these economic structures. So how do they counter, challenge, resist, whatever, proclaim a gospel that's really different? So I get your basis of anti-racist discourse just maintains the system. How is Redeemer any different?
Yeah. So for those let me repeat the question for the folks not in the room. First of all, it was posed by Professor Russell Zhang of San Francisco State and legendary status within Asian American Studies and leader of the Stop AAPI Hate, which is an extraordinary service to our community. So I should just say that because Russell matters that much for a lot of us. So Russell's question is, insofar as I've said that the problem with orthodox anti-racism is it doesn't really actually touch those structures and systems it's meant to, instead perpetuating what I call a anti-racist culture war. Does an entity that I describe in my book, Redeemer Community Church in the Bayview Hunters Point part of San Francisco, actually do that as well? Do they actually put a dent in the structures and systems? Or by way of having a for-profit software company, an educational system that uses as its standards the University of California admissions, right? The way it circulates money, does it really simply do the same kind of thing, and maybe with a happier face? In this case, not only a progressive Christian one, but a progressive Christian Asian one. So it's a happy Christian Asian American racial capitalist space. I honestly don't know the answer to this question. Someone raised this in a review. My friend Aaron Stauffer, who's a professor at Vanderbilt, asked, as admirable as he thinks Redeemer is, as much as it's obvious those folks have sacrificed their lives for their neighbors, at the end of the day, is it simply a form of what Aaron calls benevolent capitalism? Because as we all know, profit markets and charitable giving are not opposed realities. In some ways, you would say that one's the logical conclusion of the other. I think that's the force of Russell's question, as I understand it. The reason I don't know the answer to this question, or the reason I can't answer it with much confidence, is because if racial capitalism is as totalizing as I've tried to describe, it's been very hard to demark, right, when one ends and another thing begins. So with the question of profit, with the form of education, there's things that are going on there that are radically different than standard markets, that would carry on the idea that markets in themselves are not bad things. Markets are things of community, of people, of exchange, of relationships. And so we could say we're not against markets as such, we're against bad predatory markets. So you could make those kinds of distinctions. When the CEO of Dayspring Partners, the software company, commits to a 3-to-1 ratio of in terms of how much he makes and the person that's lowest on the totem pole in his company, right? He very much pushes against the tech industry that Carolyn's writing about this in her research, where the ratio is up to 300-to-1. So these are radical gestures, and your question still stands. That's why I'm very interested, but also cautious about a term within very radical parts of anti-racism that refers to abolition. Are the structures and systems so entrenched? Do their pilings run so deep into the earth? Are we so far gone that we need something like an abolitionist relationship to them? In the same way that in the midst of chattel slavery, the question wasn't, should we amend or make better chattel slavery? It was, this is so far morally gone that we need to get rid of it entirely. And so Russell's question would raise similar types of stakes in terms of racial capitalism. And here, I don't know. Part of me thinks you're right. And it's not, but in that case, it really wouldn't just be the Redeemers and the Dayspring Partners of the world. It would be the vast lot of us, including, of course, we all know us academics, and the way university systems also utilize and exploit systems of domination. And so how do we think about this? I don't know. My answer is, I'm not quite sure. Here's one thing I do offer, or I try to suggest in the book, is that insofar as we imagine our world as an intersected ecology, then we don't need to think about abolition as an up-down either-or proposition. There are ways in which microforms of witness do introduce into our ecology different idioms, conventions, and ways of thinking. If we can offer enough of those, then you can imagine the dial, maybe the needle moving a little bit. But it's also the case that certain systems of thought will have different ways of imagining what abolition comes to, what it amounts to. Christianity offers an account, right, that's apocalyptic in nature. And I want to describe what Dayspring is doing as on the one hand, still entrenched within structures and systems of capitalism, but on the other hand, offering apocalyptic gestures to a different world, a different way our world can be organized. But it's, like I said, I think it's an impossible question. It's an amazingly good question, but an impossible one to answer, I think. I don't know, do you want to say how you think about this?
Yeah, well, that sounds very,
Okay.
very Hauerwasian.
Okay. Russell said it sounds very Hauerwasian. Yes.
So thank you for the talk. I think the answer has to be yes. I mean, honestly.
That, yes, it's a difference.
Yeah, I mean, well, no, the answer is, hey, look, I'll read the book. But the analysis of racial capitalism, I'm assuming you're doing some kind of gloss with Senator Robinson, right? And Senator Robinson, when he talks about racial capitalism, he's talking about it in regard of Black radical tradition, right? Black Marxism has these conclusions that they don't have an account for. I think there's an analog here, right? And then if you're going to pose this community in San Francisco as salutary, that they represent a deep economy. I'm not sure it's deep enough, truthfully, to use your metaphor. But then more presently, that it may be proclamation, it may be prophetic. I mean, the abolitionists, as you said, in the 19th century, they were apocalyptic, they were eschatological. They were predicting an end to a world, metaphorically or actually. And if you accept the premises of racial capitalism, which is totalizing, hegemonic, inescapable, I don't think you have any choice. I think kind of marginal, micro pushbacks and gestures are insufficient. I mean, it's too, as Senator Robinson says, it's a totality. And what are you going to do in the face of totality? Gestures aren't sufficient. So how would you respond to that?
I guess I would ask what you mean by gestures are not sufficient for achieving the apocalypse that we're pushing
Well, what's
towards.
the challenge then? I mean, if the challenge is you have a fundamental dissatisfaction, discontent with racial capitalism,
Right.
and you know that these gestures are partial, by definition.
Right.
Why not go farther? Why not inscribe a more radical run at it than something that's kind of micro?
Right. Yeah. So first of all, I would want to make sure we understand how radical what they are doing is, how uncommon, right? So there are pockets of people doing this, but it is a pretty unique model. It offers some significant gestures against the models around itself. Does it reprisonate or recirculate the same circuits and energies? Certainly. But in and of itself, these are appreciable realities. Now, the question you ask is, should it go further? So one version of further, and this, Russell, will really get to the Hauerwasian bit. One version of further is to imagine revolution in terms of forms of violence, that there's literal forms of overthrowing. And this is the too far gone analysis, right? It is to say that we're not going to amend or change incrementally through the legislature chattel slavery. This is a moment where war is necessary. And so is that how we ought to think about, right? Should we think about abolition or apocalypse within literal forms of violence and uprising? And this is where I push my account of Christian witness against what I consider the Marxist analysis here. And what I say is that violent forms of revolution are not actually revolutionary. They're in the circuits and the systems and the histories of this planet. That's what we usually do. And in almost every case, when we exercise those forms of violence, we justify it because we believe we're on the right side of history. I want to resist that and take that off the table. That's where the Christianity, as I said in the paper, makes all the difference for me. I have to believe that whatever cross and resurrection name, they name a different form, not just, right, a different time or a different sequence, but a different form of revolution that staves off the inevitable, extraordinarily powerful temptation to violence. You can think about this in two ways. You can think about it practically, right? That when we enact forms of violence, that's all that will be heard is the violence. But you could also think about it theologically, that what I'm trying to bank in, and this is what I imagine an ecology, it's an ecology that is enveloping not simply the histories of Black San Francisco and BVHP within San Francisco, but that history is itself participating in God's history of what I call running, that's what I describe as running through with justice and mercy, that it's enveloped right into the life of God. That's the only way you stave off the violence. Now, if someone says to me, surely that's a form of accommodation, surely that's an opiate. I'll have to grant that that's the case. And this is where I say in the book, there are metaphysics and there are metaphysics. And someone may not share that metaphysics and think that within this world, a more immediate and often violent form of revolution is necessary. And I would have to grant that point. Yeah, please.
There are revolutions and there are revolutions, right? I mean, there are violent ones, right? And so you use theological terms, like what's the form of theological debt for racial capitalism that you could bear witness to? That may not go as far as warfare, but is as committed to that transformation.
Right.
And that to me is a challenge.
Yeah, and you could think about something like Duquan and Gregory Thompson's book, Reparations. And they're calling for something further than what we're seeing that Redeemer is able to accomplish. But they're asking for a massive upheaval of how we understand our economic structures. I don't understand Redeemer as opposed to that. I think Redeemer introduces into the ecology of our shared environments concepts that open up to those questions. To me, the question of reparations and that level of transformation is not a question of if, whether we should do it, it's how we would do it. And it would enact forms of structural and systemic change that I think you're gesturing towards. It's a great question.
Okay, so I have a question here from the virtual audience. This is from Seth Gators. He says, can you name your similarities or differences with John McWhorter's recent book criticizing what he calls an orthodoxy of anti-racism?
So Seth is a good friend. Thank you, Seth, for that amazingly difficult question or controversial. So Seth makes mention, or Professor Gators makes mention of John McWhorter. John McWhorter is a linguist at Columbia, but also does a lot of writing that challenges the same kinds of anti-racist discourse that I challenge. Now, McWhorter is equally trenchant in his critique of the discourse. And he has done an amazing job, in my view, of showing the problems and the slippages of the discourse, how the grammar and logic of it works. The place that is very different between me and McWhorter, though, is that McWhorter is not committed to the same types of transformation. In other words, McWhorter doesn't see this fundamentally as a challenge of capitalism. I think he thinks this is a challenge of culture with some capitalist leanings. And so McWhorter, he would then be situated within a camp of, say, conservative Black intellectual thought that wants to think about these things separate from the questions of political economy. Now, I think McWhorter is actually much more interesting than that, than some of those folks in that field. And I think a lot of it's pretty convincing what he says, but that's where I would understand the difference.
Okay. Here's a question from Pham. What are some other practical ways that you envision the church, communities, families, individuals, ordinary non-academic people can think and do to help bring the true transformation to the issue at hand? I wonder what practical suggestions you may have for most of us non-entrepreneur people.
So the question is, what other things would I suggest in terms of, say, ordinary folks in their ordinary lives that would challenge these things? One of the things I emphasize in this talk and in the book is that these are conventions and practices of ordinary people. As I said in the book, these systems largely persist because of our commitments to them as beneficiaries. And so the things that we can do are right in front of us in everyday ordinary things. It's just that in most cases, we don't want to do them. We don't want to do them because they're costly. They draw us into orbits and forms of life that are challenging to us. And they just seem simply out of sync with the kinds of things on offer. One of the stories I tell in the book is, and this gets back to the previous two questions. One of the stories I tell in the book is of a woman that was at Stanford University. At Stanford, she was told two things at once. One, that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and two, that she's at Stanford to stop that from happening. That's why she was at Stanford, right? She's the best and the brightest, and those people are especially well positioned to change the world. She describes hearing that repeatedly as a student, and then experiencing what she calls a depressive episode. she became paralyzed, overwhelmed by the moral responsibility in front of her. She dropped out of Stanford for the quarter, withdrew from Stanford for the quarter, and then went and lived with the Redeemer people who she knew through some friends and relatives. What she described there was what she calls extraordinary people living in very ordinary ways. She describes an experience in church and in the liturgy of allowing the scripture and the litany to wash over her, to change her disposition on these questions. And what she saw is people who are committed to living radically, living ordinary. With the confidence, right, this goes back to the question of revolution. With the confidence, as I put in my book, that Christians are not those who have to sit around and wait for the revolution to start. Rather, they need to lean into a revolution 2,000 years in the making. The practices available for ordinary people to challenge these structures or systems are always right in front of us. That's what makes them so hard. If we didn't have opportunities to challenge systems of debt and predation and ownership, right? Or in different systems, resource hoarding, right? Divisions in terms of where we live, what kind of neighborhoods we imagine, how we imagine our city's relationship to our communities, what we call our systems to account for. If those things weren't right at hand and available to us, and in some sense, then these would be abstract questions. I think there are different traditions that have different ways of thinking about this. As a Christian theologian, I think about it in these terms. Jesus has made pretty clear and pretty available what we can be doing. It's just that those are pretty hard things, or at least we live in a world that has taught us to think they are hard and impossible things.
Okay, so here's a question from Yvette Latune. How can the White House initiatives on racial equity be used to change systems?
How can the White House efforts on racial equity be used to change systems? Russell, can you tell me what the White House?
They have multiple priorities, changing the policies, changing the personnel, but like you say, not changing the political economy.
And that would be your assessment from a person that has been somewhat involved with national policy making.
That's what I would say after hearing your talk.
Right. So what Russell Jones, the expert in the room, says is that these policies are gestures and attempts to change minimal things, but largely leave the rest of it standing.
That's some funding. I mean,
With some real funding and real teeth. So, and in some ways, how to divide them or draw a line between them and a redeemer would be a question. I take that that's the force of your question. So, yeah, how you would think through that. So.
But I think this person is asking, well, then what would you do? I mean, you proposed an answer given like what religious and faith communities could do. Well, what can the White House do? I think is what this person is asking. Where
okay.
You're in control. Well, you're part of the system and you're a leader in the system, right? In the political economy. So.
Right. Okay, so if I propose a route for, say, certain religious communities to lean into, how do we think about these sets of questions from the U.S. government? Right, how should the White House think about these questions? Well, I mean, this is a difficult question because, in some sense, the White House has largely decided that's how it became. This is how it became the White House. This is how these folks got access to power and authority by doubling down on the very systems that they went against. Right. So think about 2016. Right. Hillary Clinton basically made a decision that poor white people didn't matter morally and they didn't matter politically. And she was wrong, obviously, on the first one, and she became wrong on the second one. Insofar as then what Trump was able to do was once again pull up old lies about racial identity and demonize people of color and make them, right, the perpetrators of the sorry life that many people in America live, right, and then to manipulate the masses along these ways. So if you have a government then that's already kind of sworn into this, right? And you can read this history in terms of the US government's commitment to say some forms of financial capitalism, the support of the banking industry, come what may, then those who get elected have already to live within the stream of the world. And here I would say that there is a marked difference between that structure and system than what the folks at Redeemer are doing. Now, I take the force of the question is that the White House, though, is in a position to do a lot more and at scale and in scope than, say, a Redeemer. But this is, I want to push against that a little bit and say, on the one hand, it's clear that the US government, right, state government, the municipal powers in the Bay Area can do at a wider scope. Just like, say, the partnership between charitable, organizations, NGOs, and say multinational corporations can operate at a scale and scope that a Redeemer could only dream of, or maybe they wouldn't dream of, right? And so I think that's part of the question I'm asking about ecology. Is the idea to inhabit positions and seats of power that we think can change these realities, or is it very likely that, as our history shows us, inhabiting those seats, getting access to them, requires so many compromises along the way that getting there already you lose what you need. And so that's where I would say actually say these on the ground realities that say, what I can see around me and what I can control, right, is access to education for these kids in my neighborhood. Now, I would like to agitate for change at the city and state level, and I'm going to do that. But what do we do with these children now? How do we serve them now as neighbors? And I think that kind of question, I want to press against the idea that the primary logic we have to use is one that looks for greatest scope and scale, because I want to question whether getting that scope and scale costs us too much. But do I hope the White House ushers in policy changes with real teeth? And do I think this White House, do I live in a world where all White Houses are, the same thing? Absolutely not. I think that it's an obvious moral advance, this White House, prior to the other one. So there are ways to make distinctions within a world so that we don't live in a universe where all cats are gray. But I also want to say that there are also other ways, and this is why the ecological framing really matters. If we believe ourselves interconnected in these ways, then some of the smallest types of changes do introduce into our society, right, idioms and concepts that might change up the game.
So first of all, I apologize because I haven't read your book, but I'm reading it furiously right now.
Thank you.
You gained one reader, probably many more. But one question that I had was, so one of the reasons I do keep going back to Baylor all the time on capitalism is because he's interested in motivation at the individual level, right? That's what Spirit is in that title. And so in the preface, I see that you are talking about libido dominante. And I'm just curious about
this is a great
whether
question.
or not there is a parallel to that in the vision that you're talking about. I.e., what would motivate people to participate? Because you talked about what does motivate people to participate in racist structures. So what about this other vision?
Yeah, so one question people have asked is if I'm operating at the level of structures and systems, what about individuals, especially psychological imaginaries, which we know diseased psychological imaginaries is what racism runs through and dominates. What I want to say is that's absolutely right. Individuals are nodes in systems of domination and power, right? That's why it's important for me. The book develops of what I described. This is why I think we're quite different than Cedric Robinson. His account of racial capitalism. Mine comes with a fully built-in what I call moral psychology, right? How individuals are situated and formed within these systems through what I call a moral psychology of use, identity, and justification. It goes on to certain theories of perception, action theory, and these kinds of things. So it's absolutely the case that individuals matter in this story, or in the language of Augustine, desires matter, or in the language of Weber, and I would say Hegel, motivation matters. That Geist is talking to a system where the individual and the corporate are interweaving and co-emerging principles. That's absolutely critical. if we don't understand that, then we don't, that's what my whole point about conventions is, right? That's all based on kind of theory of language about how individuals are engrafted into ways of speaking and seeing and acting in the world. And so that's why I want to say that this is why the ecology matters. If you can effectuate any part of that, you introduce into it, right, these different, we say, bad, porous, evil desires, right? And what capitalism does is produce a certain desirous subject. And what we need to do is introduce other kinds of subjects where desire works differently, where motivation works differently. And that's why I think that we, in order to do this, we have to understand this as wide a frame as possible. And so Hegel, Weber, the tradition of American pragmatism are deeply influential streams of thought within this. So this is a great question, though.
Okay, I'm going to throw you a fun question.
Okay.
This is Jeremy Chen. He said, you mentioned Aquafina. Follow up. He didn't say follow up, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Jeremy Chen is doing some great things in Philadelphia. So, I earlier said, if you have time in the Q&A, ask me about Aquafina. I really want to do that, as I was telling Professor Chen earlier, because I want to ask you all how you think about the current Aquafina controversy, which, as I understand it, has to do with certain stories about her past that look like the appropriation of Black culture. And what do we do with that appropriation, especially since that appropriation in some sense allowed her to ascend within Hollywood's, ascend to the upper elite ranks of Hollywood. This goes to larger questions about culture and appropriation and predation and these kinds of things. By the way, there's a playwright here, Philip Katanda. I don't know if you all know him, but he wrote, and I described this in the book, he wrote a play that in some sense anticipates this question by, 6, 7 decades, and it situates in the history by 6 or 7 decades. In this story, after the internment, the Japanese return to the Fillmore in San Francisco, where they had been forcibly removed by the internment. During the time when they had been imprisoned in concentration camps in the deserts of the West, African Americans who were being exploited for their labor during the war moved in because, of course, the US government wanted their labor but didn't want to provide them housing. So at the end of the war, you had a confrontation over a part of San Francisco that no one else wanted, but once again, everyone's fighting for the scraps thrown off the edge of the table. And so what Katana does is he stages this drama in a play where one of the returning Japanese Americans after the internment is a big lover of jazz. Why? Because jazz, as in the African American community, right, as well as the Japanese community in the internment camps, became a point of pride. It became a point of dignity. In the midst of struggles, the blues gives us a way to articulate and form new modes of humanity. The question, though, becomes whether this character, when he returns and his love for jazz, is appropriating Black culture. And I think this is where the Aquafina thing becomes a little bit more complex than simply naked appropriation. What if you imagine that the struggles of an Asian immigrant, right, an Asian immigrant woman, in her attempt to find forms of identity in this country that are not simply acquiescing to racial capitalism, but enacting modes of resistance and power and liberation, finds an approximate witness in the African American tradition. And she inhabits that witness as a way to say, no matter what, I'm not like those people, the white exploiters. This is the most proximate identity I can find that expresses the type of humanity that I want to live. Do we want to be so quick to call that appropriation? Or do we want to imagine that as a site of identity, right, where multiple registers come into play, not simply, right, Black and white race, but in this case, Asian and Asian American, migrancy, gender, right? These are all in play. And I think it's a mistake to go too quickly to say that she's inappropriately appropriated an identity. I want to imagine something more fruitful and productive in this interaction. The other thing I was saying to the folks here earlier is the other part of this that you worry about as an Asian American is the continuous narrative, right, that Asian Americans are always on the wrong side of the white-black binary. And once they're on the wrong side, once they're marginalized to the edges of that, then they're coming onto the field is always going to be read suspiciously. And so we want to think about whether we're not reinforcing that binary by, in a sense, piling on Awkwafina. Now, are there questions about how she's utilized and articulated Black identity and culture? Of course there are. And it's certainly in the prerogative of communities to raise those questions. But I'm hoping that we'll complexify it enough to see that there's also fruitful possibilities for how we imagine what's happening. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you for the folks in the room, for the folks on Zoom with us, Professor Chen, the center, both Berkeley, the Graduate Theological Union, and everyone for bringing me out.